In 2002, deep within the Baba Mountains of Afghanistan, a silent decision was made to erase a nightmare. An elite U.S. Army squad had vanished. No bodies, no shell casings, only the smell of old copper and rotting meat. When the search team entered a massive cave, they didn't find insurgents, they found a man, 13 feet tall. With hair as red as blood, 6 fingers on each hand, and double rows of teeth, this creature was not human. Modern rifles failed, and only a desperate blast of explosives ended the life of a being, from before history. Hours later, a C-130 cargo plane arrived to carry away a secret that the Pentagon officially deleted from existence. Why are the witnesses forced to sign NDAs? Why is that cave now sealed with concrete? The archives are finally speaking. Prepare your mind, for you are about to step into the Kandahar blackout. Welcome to Silent War Archives, the vault where forgotten documents finally speak. In the early months of 2002, the U.S. military was operating in a landscape that defied every map. The Baba Mountains weren't just high, they were a labyrinth of ancient stone and whispers. A squad of 9 soldiers, elite commandos, were sent to establish a high-altitude observation post. They were the best of the best. But as they climbed higher into the thin air, the radio checks became shorter, and the silence between transmissions grew longer. The silent decision to send them into the dead zone was the first mistake. On the 4th night, the base at Bagram received a final burst of encrypted data. It wasn't a tactical report, it was a rhythmic pulse. A series of rapid clicks that sounded like a panic attack in binary. The radio operator tried to re-establish contact, but the mountain had already swallowed the signal. The silent order was given to wait, to assume it was atmospheric interference. But those who were listening, they knew. Something had reached out from the darkness, and it had cut the line. When the search team was finally dispatched, they weren't told about the disappearance. They were told it was a communication drill. But the specialists on the helicopter, they saw the look in the eyes of the high command. It was fear. A silent decision had been made to keep the incident off the official logs. They moved toward the last known coordinates, into a region where the compass needles began to spin in a full circle, as if the very iron in the mountain was awake. Halfway up the ridge, they found the first signs of the lost squad. A backpack, shredded. A rifle, bent in half like a piece of dry wood. But there was no blood, no footprints leading away, and most terrifyingly, no shell casings. It was as if the soldiers had been plucked from the earth before they could even squeeze the trigger. The search team stood in a circle, weapons raised, staring into a fog that felt like a living entity. The silent truth was starting to reveal itself. As they approached the summit, the temperature didn't drop, it rose. A warm, wet breeze began to blow from the caves below. It carried a scent that the veterans of the team could never forget, the smell of raw, ancient copper, and something that had been dead for 10,000 years. One soldier reported that the air tasted thicker, as if they were breathing in the biological residue of a predator. The silent decision to continue the mission was the moment they became the next target. Then, the hum began. A low-frequency vibration that you didn't hear with your ears, you felt it in your teeth. It was the heartbeat of the mountain. Seismic sensors showed a rhythmic thumping coming from sublevel 0. Miles beneath the ice. The soldiers began to experience static hallucinations, seeing shadows that moved against the wind, hearing voices that spoke in a language older than any human civilization. The archives call it high-altitude stress, but we know it was the signal of the Kandahar giant. They found the mouth of the cave at 3:14 a.m., the archive hour. It was a perfect, geometric opening in the granite, as if it had been carved by a giant's hand. The entrance was lined with human bones, but they weren't Afghan, they were ancient. Among the remains were modern U.S. Army boots, neatly lined up as if for inspection. The silent decision to enter that cave was a descent into a hell that the Pentagon had spent billions to hide from the world. Local Afghan elders spoke of the mouth that should not open. They told stories of a race of giants with hair as red as the desert sun, who had been asleep since the days of the Great Flood. They said these beings didn't eat animals, they ate souls. When the U.S. soldiers scoffed at these superstitions, the elders simply turned their backs. They knew that the silent fleet of the ancients was finally waking up. And the first squad had been the appetizer. One soldier had a high-tech head cam, recording the descent. But as he stepped past the threshold, the image began to melt. Not a technical glitch, but a deliberate distortion. The silent decision was made to scrub that footage from the main server, but a single frame survived. It showed a pair of eyes, glowing amber, 30 feet in the air. The high command called it lens flare, but the pilot who saw it, he never spoke again. On the walls of the cave, they found handprints. Massive, bloody marks that had 6 fingers. These weren't artistic drawings, they were territorial markers. Scientists who later analyzed the residue found that the DNA was impossible. It was human, but it had 4 extra chromosomes that don't exist in our species. The silent decision to classify this DNA as inconclusive was the ultimate act of historical erasure. We are living on the skin of a world that we do not own. The air inside the cave was sub-zero, yet the sweat on the soldiers' faces was boiling. The electromagnetic field was so strong it began to vibrate the atoms of their bodies. One soldier claimed he could hear his mother's voice through his tactical radio, but his mother had been dead for 10 years. The mountain was using their own memories against them. The silent decision to continue was no longer an order, it was a compulsion. They were being called into the abyss. What happens when the hunter becomes the observed? The search team realized that every step they took was being recorded. Not by cameras, but by the walls themselves. They found carvings that updated in real time, showing the silhouettes of the 9 missing soldiers being absorbed into the rock. The silent decision was to treat these as ancient artifacts, but the soldiers knew the truth: the archive was alive. And it was still hungry. At the bottom of the first shaft, they heard it. Not a gunshot, but a scream that broke the silence of 80 years. It was the voice of the first squad leader, but his voice was layered. 1,000 voices speaking through a single throat. He was calling out for reinforcements, but he was also reciting grid coordinates that led to nowhere. The silent decision was to cut the feed, but the echo, it still vibrates in the static of every military frequency today. They were no longer a search team, they were participants in a biological harvest. The high command at Bagram ordered them to retreat, but the doors of the cave had already begun to shift. The rock was moving like liquid. The silent decision to seal the entrance from the outside was signed in Washington 30 minutes later. They were being sacrificed to keep the secret inside. The echo of the lost patrol was finally joined by 9 more voices. As the screen fades to black, remember that the silence of Kandahar is not an ending, it's a pause. The archives tell us that some battles are never won, they are just postponed. The specialist team was about to face a monster that doesn't die, but in the next chapter, we witnessed the battle for the forbidden truth. The blackout is absolute, but the archive still listens. The helicopter blades cut through the thin, frozen air of the Baba Mountains like a serrated knife. Below us, the terrain was a jagged maze of obsidian black rock and swirling gray mist. The search team, hardened operators from the elite special forces, sat in total silence. They were heading toward a coordinate that didn't exist on any civilian map, a location known only as Point Zero. The silent decision to land in this vertical abyss was the moment our reality began to fray at the edges. Just before we hit the ground, the onboard thermal sensors began to scream. A massive heat signature, larger than any animal, was pulsing from a hidden ledge on the mountainside. It wasn't a fire, it was a biological bloom. A rhythmic, hot glow that looked like a giant heart beating inside the stone. The pilot tried to adjust the gain, but the screen melted into a white-hot static. The silent order was to disregard the glitch, but we all felt the air suddenly turn warm and heavy. As the boots hit the snow, the smell hit our lungs. It wasn't the clean, sharp scent of the mountains. It was the stench of old copper, rotting meat, and a wet, primal musk that made our stomachs turn. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse, but one that had been frozen for an eternity and then suddenly thawed. One veteran operator gagged, his hand reaching for his gas mask. The silent decision to move forward was an act of madness, but the archive demanded a witness. We found the first field of bones 50 yards from the entrance. They weren't scattered by animals, they were stacked. Thousands of ribs, skulls, and vertebrae, bleached white by a sun that never reached this depth. But these weren't the bones of villagers. They were larger, thicker, with jawbones that had double rows of teeth. Among the ancient remains, we saw the glint of modern steel. A U.S. Army dog tag, half buried in the white dust. The silent truth was undeniable, this place was a dining room. Then we saw the gear of the missing squad. A Kevlar vest, ripped in two like paper. A heavy machine gun, crushed into a ball of mangled iron. There was no sign of a firefight, no bullet marks on the rocks. It was as if something had simply reached out from the shadows, and compressed their reality into a single, violent moment. The silent decision to suppress the evidence of this destruction began right there. The team leader picked up a helmet, it was empty, but the chin strap had been sliced by something sharper than a scalpel. The most unnerving part was the silence. No wind, no mountain goats, not even the sound of a distant bird. Nature had officially abandoned the Shadow Ridge. It was as if the animals knew what we were too stubborn to admit, that the mountain was no longer ours. The air was dead still, yet our tactical sensors showed high-frequency vibrations that made our hair stand on end. The silent order to maintain radio silence felt redundant. Even if we had screamed, we knew the sound would never leave this valley. Carved into the granite surrounding the cave mouth were symbols that defied history. Not Arabic, not Pashto, but a series of geometric runes that pulsated with a faint, violet light. They looked like the veins of the mountain itself, twisting and turning in patterns that made our eyes ache. One specialist, a linguist from the secret archives, stepped back in terror. He whispered that these were the seals of the Nephilim, a language of giants that was used to lock away the things that the Great Flood couldn't drown. Suddenly, a gust of wind rushed out of the cave mouth. It wasn't the cold air of the summit, it was hot, wet, and smelling of sulfur and wet dog. It hit us like a physical blow, and our night vision goggles suddenly flared into a blinding green wash. The temperature gauge on my wrist jumped 50 degrees in seconds. The silent decision to ignore the warning signs was now the only thing keeping us moving. We were being pulled in, not by an order, but by a gravitational hunger that seemed to live inside the rock. Then we saw it. Pressed deep into the frozen clay at the very edge of the cave mouth, was a footprint. It was twice the size of a human foot, and it had 6 toes. The weight required to press a mark that deep into solid ice was calculated at over 3,000 pounds. It wasn't a man, and it wasn't an ape. It was something that walked upright, something that knew how to wait. A silent decision was made to photograph the mark, but when the camera flash went off, the footprint seemed to move, as if the ground itself was trying to hide the evidence. Every mechanical system began to fail at once. The bolts on the rifles seized, the batteries on the tactical lights began to drain in seconds. It was an electromagnetic dead zone. The mountain was stripping us of our modern dignity, leaving us with only our primitive senses. One soldier tried to clear his jam, but the metal of the gun was so cold it fused to his gloves. The silent order to fix the equipment was impossible to execute. We were no longer special forces, we were just men, standing at the edge of a grave, with nothing but our fear to protect us. In the silence, we heard it. Not a voice from the radio, but an echo from inside the cave. It sounded like our names being called. Thorne. Miller. Jenkins. The voices were distorted, layered, like a choir of ghosts speaking through a wet cloth. It was the voice of the missing squad leader, but he was asking us to come inside, it's so much warmer here. The specialists call it acoustic phantoms, but we knew the truth, the cave was a mouth, and it was already tasting our names. Our eyes began to betray us. The dark wasn't just dark, it was solid. We saw shapes moving in the shadows, tall, elongated figures that didn't use feet to walk, they seemed to glide. When we shined our failing lights on them, they disappeared. But when we closed our eyes, they were still there, etched into our retinas in a sickly amber light. The silent decision to treat this as hallucination was the only way to keep our sanity from breaking. The mountain was projecting our own nightmares onto the walls, and the archives were recording every second of it. Our local guide, a man who had lived his whole life in Kandahar, suddenly fell to his knees. He began to claw at his own face, shouting that the eye is open. He refused to step 1 foot past the threshold, even when threatened with his life. He told us that once we entered, we would belong to the silent fleet of the dead. He fled into the darkness of the ridge, his screams echoing for miles. The silent decision was made to let him go, because deep down, we all wanted to run with him. Then, the heartbeat came back. Thump. 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 A low-frequency thud that made the very mountain groan. The snow began to slide off the ridges, and the ground beneath our boots felt like it was turning into liquid. Every strike of the pulse sent a shockwave of fear through our bodies. It was a countdown, and we were the time bomb. The silent decision to break the seal was no longer ours. The mountain was opening its mouth, and we were the first course. We crossed the threshold at 4:30 p.m., the exact moment the archives recorded the first, glitched, signal. As we stepped into the dark, the air behind us simply vanished. The entrance was gone. We were in the throat of the beast now, and the forbidden truth was waiting for us in the dark. Prepare your mind, for in the next chapter, we come face to face with the 13-foot nightmare. The archive is officially open. We were deep inside the belly of the mountain now, where the air was thick with the smell of wet fur and ancient blood. Our tactical lights were failing, flickering like dying stars. Suddenly, the darkness at the end of the corridor moved. It wasn't a shadow, it was a solid mass that blocked out everything. A silent decision was made to hold the line, but our instincts were screaming to run. Something was breathing in the dark, a heavy, wet rasp that sounded like a steam engine. One soldier fired a flare, and for 5 seconds, the hell was illuminated. Looking down at us, from a height of 13 feet, was a being that shouldn't exist. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over muscles that looked like bundles of steel cable. But it was the hair that was most striking, a long, matted mane as red as a dying sun. It stood upright, like a man, but with the raw power of a god from a forgotten era. The silent archive was finally face to face with its owner. As it stepped forward, we saw its hands. They were enormous, each palm the size of a man's torso. And there, glowing in the strobe light, were 6 fingers. Thick, powerful digits ending in nails that were more like talons. It clutched a massive spear, a weapon made of a dark, crystalline wood that hummed with the same frequency as the mountain. The silent decision to engage was no longer a choice, it was a necessity for survival. The creature let out a roar that shattered our night vision lenses, a sound that was less like a voice, and more like a physical blow. It happened in the blink of an eye. Before our lead operator could raise his rifle, the giant lunged. The spear moved with an impossible speed, a blur of dark wood that pierced clean through the soldier's Kevlar armor. He was lifted 3 feet off the ground, as if he were nothing more than a doll. The smell of fresh blood, mixed with the ancient stench of the cave, and the air became electric with the scream of a dying man. The silent decision to stay had just cost us our first brother. The archive was no longer watching, it was participating. The team opened fire. A chaotic strobe of muzzle flashes illuminated the cave. Hundreds of rounds of 5.56 and .50 caliber bullets were pumped into the giant's chest. But it didn't fall, it didn't even flinch. We watched in horror as the bullets seemed to disappear into its pale flesh. There was no blood, only a spray of gray ash that swirled in the air. It was as if the creature was phasing in and out of our dimension. The silent decision to use conventional weapons was a catastrophic failure. We were fighting a being that defied the laws of ballistics. The giant roared again, and this time, it was close. As it leaned down to grab our medic, I saw its mouth. It had double rows of teeth, sharp, jagged ivory that looked like it belonged to a shark. It wasn't built for eating animals, it was built for crushing bone. The silent decision to retreat was made, but the exit was blocked by a wall of liquid rock. We were trapped in a slaughterhouse with a butcher who was older than the mountains themselves. The medic's screams were cut short by a sound like a dry branch snapping, the sound of a human spine giving way. The giant swung its spear in a wide arc, the blade glowing with a sickly violet light. It didn't just cut, it dissolved anything it touched. One of our heavy weapons specialists had his arm vaporized in a split second. No blood, no cauterization, just a void where the flesh used to be. The creature was moving with a grace that was beautiful and terrifying. It wasn't angry, it was executing us. It was the silent decision of a gardener, removing weeds from a forbidden patch of soil. We were down to 3 men. The ammunition was gone, and our morale was a pile of ash. Then, our team leader realized the giant's weakness. It wasn't the bullets, it was the connection. Every time it moved, the symbols on the cave walls would pulse in sync with its heart. He grabbed the remaining bricks of C4, and our only at 4 rocket launcher. He knew that if we couldn't kill the giant, we had to kill the mountain. The silent decision was made to sacrifice the archive, to save the world from what was inside. Fire in the hole. The words echoed for an eternity. The At-4 rocket shrieked across the chamber, not at the giant, but at the glowing runes on the ceiling. The explosion was a blinding whiteout. Thousands of tons of granite and ice began to rain down. The giant let out a final, layered scream that sounded like 1,000 voices crying out in a language of the stars. It reached for us, its 6 fingers mere inches from my throat, and then, the roof of the world collapsed. The silent decision had finally been carried out, through a planned catastrophe. For 10 minutes, there was nothing but the sound of our own ragged breathing and the settling of the rock. The air was a thick curtain of gray dust, tasting of C4 and ancient rot. When our flashlights finally pierced the gloom, the giant was gone. Buried under a mountain of stone. Only the tip of its spear, still glowing faint blue, was visible above the debris. The silent archive was now a tomb, but we were still inside. The exit was sealed, and the mountain was settling back into a deep, uneasy sleep. Suddenly, the ground began to vibrate again. But this wasn't the giant, it was the twin rotors of a Chinook helicopter. The specialists had finally arrived. They didn't come with medical kits, they came with industrial drills and vacuum-sealed containers. Men in white sterile hazmat suits, with faceless reflective visors, descended through a vertical shaft they had drilled into the ceiling. They didn't even look at us. They went straight for the rubble. The silent decision to harvest the remains had been signed in Washington before the first rocket was even fired. We were loaded into a separate transport, blindfolded and strapped into chairs. As we lifted off, I saw through a gap in the fabric a massive, elongated wooden crate being loaded into a C-130. It was 15 feet long, and it was leaking a dark, ink-like liquid that smoked in the cold air. The silent fleet was taking its cargo home. We were told that we were the lucky ones, that our silence would be rewarded with a pension and a new identity. The silent decision to delete the Kandahar giant from history was now our only lifeline. In a windowless room at Fort Bragg, they showed us footage of our own families. They told us that the giant didn't exist, that we had suffered from mass hysteria due to high-altitude oxygen deprivation. They made us sign documents with redacted lines that felt like a death warrant. The silent decision to treat us as mental patients was the ultimate cover-up. If we ever spoke, we would be archived just like the Lost Squad. We weren't soldiers holding a position, we were witnesses to a reality that the world wasn't ready to face. But how do you delete a nightmare? At 3:14 a.m. every night. I still hear that roar. I still see those glowing amber eyes staring at me from the dark corners of my room. The silent war is still raging inside my head. I look at my own hands, and I count the fingers, making sure there are only 5. The trauma isn't a memory, it's a biological frequency that the mountain tuned me into. The archives tell us that once you've seen the giant, you become a part of its fleet. You become a secondary anchor for the silence. As we close this chapter on the Kandahar giant, remember that the mountain doesn't sleep. It only waits. The silent decision to seal the archives was a pause, not a victory. Somewhere, under the ice and the rock, the mouth is still open. And it is still listening. If you ever hear a low-frequency hum in the silence of the night, don't go looking for the source. Some things are better left buried. Welcome to the blackout. The archive is now sealed, for now. The dust from the cave collapse had not even settled, when the silent decision was enacted. From the frozen sky, 4 unmarked black helicopters descended like predatory insects. These weren't soldiers, they were the cleansers, specialists from a black budget department that officially didn't exist. They wore white, sterile suits that looked like they were made of lead and rubber, their faces completely hidden behind dark, reflective visors. They ignored our wounds, they ignored our shock. They moved with a cold, mechanical speed, toward the rubble where the giant lay buried. They brought machines that defied the technology of 2002. High-frequency acoustic drills that could melt through solid granite in minutes. The sound they made was a high-pitched, metallic shriek that echoed across the valley, masking the sounds of the silent war. As they reached the remains, they didn't use shovels, they used vacuum-sealed containment tubes. Every drop of the giant's blood, every strand of that red, matted hair, was meticulously harvested. The silent order was simple: leave no biological trace. The archive of the living was being turned into a laboratory of the dead. By 8 a.m., a massive, elongated wooden crate was brought to the edge of the crater. It was 15 feet long, reinforced with heavy iron bands and wrapped in thick, rusted chains. As the crane lowered the pallet into the abyss, the ground began to vibrate with that same, low-frequency hum we had heard inside the cave. The specialists worked in total silence, communicating through hand signals. They loaded the giant into the wood, and sealed it with a black, viscous liquid that smoked as it touched the air. The silent cargo was ready for its final flight. The extraction was carried out under a total communications blackout. A specialized C-130 cargo plane, with no tail numbers or markings, was waiting on a makeshift runway in the desert. We watched from our transport as the giant, the forgotten secret, was loaded into the belly of the plane. The air around the aircraft seemed to shimmer and distort, as if the weight of the creature was warping the gravity of the runway. The silent decision to fly the cargo directly to Wright-Patterson was signed by a hand that had never touched a rifle. The plane vanished into the morning fog, and with it, the truth. Back at the base, the archive erasure began. Our logs were confiscated, our memory cards were smashed, and the satellite feeds from that day were replaced by atmospheric interference loops. They didn't just delete the files, they deleted the day. The personnel who were part of the mission were assigned new serial numbers and told that their previous deployment had been a hallucination. The silent decision to gaslight an entire elite unit was the ultimate act of military betrayal. We were the ghosts of a war that officially never happened. Whispers began to leak from the sublevels of the medical labs. One janitor spoke of a living room of meat, where the 13-foot specimen was being kept in a state of suspended animation. He claimed that the creature's biology was self-repairing, that every time they took a sample, the flesh would grow back in seconds. They weren't just studying it, they were trying to find the genetic key to immortality. The silent decision to turn the Kandahar giant into a biological battery was the most forbidden project in the history of the U.S. Navy. What happened to the cave? A week after the extract, the U.S. Army arrived with tons of industrial concrete and lead. They didn't just seal the entrance, they capped the entire mountain peak. They turned the Shadow Ridge into a tomb of solid stone. Local villagers were moved to relocation camps, and the area was declared a permanent no-fly zone. The silent decision was to make sure that even if someone found the coordinates, they would find only a wall of silence. The mountain was silenced, but the archive still remembers the scream. For the survivors, the desanitization was a life sentence. We were subjected to months of integrity interviews, where they used high-frequency sound waves and drugs to rewrite our memories of that cave. They wanted to turn the giant into a myth, a story told by broken men in barrooms. The silent decision to erode our grip on reality was so effective, that many of my brothers eventually disappeared into the psychiatric wards of Fort Bragg. They weren't crazy, they just couldn't live in a world where the truth was a file not found. But paper always leaves a trail. In 2012, a disgruntled cargo pilot leaked a set of flight manifests from 2002. They showed an unmarked flight from Kandahar to Ohio, carrying a payload listed only as biological specimen, 1100 series. The weight of the cargo was recorded as exactly 1,200 pounds. The silent proof was staring us in the face, but within 48 hours, the pilot was found dead in his apartment, a suicide that had all the hallmarks of a silent decision. The archives are getting heavier, and the silence is getting deadlier. Where is the giant now? Archives suggest that the creature was not killed, but suspended. It is whispered that beneath the hangars of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, there is a floor called Sublevel 10. Where the temperature is kept at absolute zero. There, in a crystalline vault, the Kandahar giant remains. Waiting for the day when the military finds a way to weaponize its phasing ability. The silent decision to keep the monster on ice is a countdown to a war that we cannot win. We are not guarding a specimen, we are guarding a god. In the 1950s, the U.S. government moved the most sensitive archives to Antarctica. Based on the Base 211 technology, they built a new sanctuary for the things that cannot die. The Kandahar giant was just one of many. The silent decision was to turn the South Pole into the world's trash can for truth. This is why you see the world leaders flying to the ice in 2016. They are checking the locks. They are making sure that the silent fleet is still under control. But the ice is melting, and the mouth is starting to breathe. I saw its eyes open through the crate. These were the final words written by a transport pilot who flew the Kandahar shipment. He claimed that the chains were vibrating, and that the wood was turning cold to the touch. He said the creature wasn't sleeping, it was tuning itself to the frequency of the plane. The silent decision was to bury the letter with the pilot, but his widow found it in a hidden compartment of his flight jacket. The archives are leaking, and the voices from 2002 are starting to scream again. How do you fund an erasure? You look at the missing billions from the Pentagon archives. In the days before September 11th, Donald Rumsfeld announced that $2.3 trillion were unaccounted for. Much of that money went into Operation Giant Sweep. It paid for the concrete, it paid for the specialists, and it paid for the silence contracts. The silent decision, to use the taxpayers' money to hide the truth from the taxpayers, is the ultimate irony of the silent war archives. We are paying for our own blackout. The silence was briefly broken in 2016. When a mysterious seismic event was detected at the Shadow Ridge. It wasn't a quake, it was an outward blast. Something had tried to break out from the concrete cap. Within hours, the restricted sky was filled with unmarked drones. The silent decision was to label it a glacial shift, but the villagers in the valley report seeing red-haired giants walking through the mist at night. The archives tell us that the mouth is no longer shut, it is just waiting. To understand the giant of Kandahar, we must look beyond the military files, and into the forbidden pages of the ancient world. Every civilization has a silent record of beings that walked the earth long before man was born. The Book of Enoch speaks of the Nephilim, the fallen ones, who were the offspring of gods and the daughters of men. These weren't just tall humans, they were biological anomalies with 6 fingers and double rows of teeth. The silent decision of modern historians to treat these as myths is the only reason we were so unprepared in 2002. The archives are clear, the giants didn't vanish, they just went underground. Why 6 fingers? In the archives of genetics, the number 6 is a silent marker of a non-human bloodline. From the Philistine giants of the Bible to the mound builders of North America, the 6-toed footprint is the signature of the Nephilim. It is a biological frequency that connects these beings to a different reality. Scientists at Fort Detrick found that the DNA of the Kandahar specimen had quad helix structures, something that simply shouldn't exist in our dimension. The silent decision to classify this as a mutation was a lie. It wasn't a mistake of nature, it was the blueprint of a master race. The double rows of teeth found in the giant's mouth were built for a specific purpose, the consumption of raw, biological energy. The Babylonian Talmud describes a race called the Rephaim, giants who possessed a hunger that could never be satisfied. They were the apex predators of the ancient world. The search team in Afghanistan found that the human bones inside the cave had been polished by these teeth, as if the marrow had been sucked out through a high-pressure vacuum. The silent decision to suppress these medical reports was made because it proved that we are not at the top of the food chain. Throughout history, red-haired giants have been reported in every corner of the globe. From the Paiute legends of the Ctcah in Nevada to the Stark people of the Navajo, the description is always the same: tall, pale, and predatory. The red hair isn't just a color, it is a silent antenna for the vril energy we discussed in our Antarctica archives. The Kandahar giant's hair was found to be active, even days after its death. It vibrated with a low-frequency hum that made the specialists' equipment malfunction. They weren't just soldiers from the past, they were the silent fleet of a civilization that never truly surrendered. Where did they go during the Great Flood? The archives of Agartha suggest that the giants used a network of world tunnels to retreat into the Earth's crust. They built crystalline sanctuaries deep beneath the mountain ranges of Afghanistan, Tibet, and Antarctica. These are the forbidden sublevels of the planet. The Kandahar giant was merely a sentry, a night watchman, who had stayed too close to the surface. The silent decision by the world's governments to keep mining and oil drilling away from certain dead zones is the ultimate proof. They know the kingdom below is still very much alive. How did the giants survive for thousands of years? It used a biological form of the phasing technology we saw in the USS Eldridge incident. These beings can vibrate their own atoms to match the frequency of the rock around them. They don't live in the cave, they live as the cave. This is why the bullets of the special forces seem to phase through the creature. It was only when the AT-4 rocket hit the anchor runes on the wall that the giant was forced back into our physical dimension. The silent decision to study this biological cloaking is the foundation of our modern stealth technology. We are stealing from the gods of the abyss. The villagers of Kandahar were right to call it the mouth that never closes. They understood that the mountain was a living entity that required a biological sacrifice to remain dormant. Every 40 years, according to the local, silent records, a group of travelers or soldiers would vanish on the Shadow Ridge. This was the toll for the peace of the valley. The U.S. military didn't stumble on a monster, they interrupted a cycle. By killing the sentry, we have officially triggered the awakening. The archive suggests that the giant of 2002 was just the first name on a list that was drafted before the birth of man. As we peel back the layers of the Nephilim bloodline, one terrifying truth remains. We are not their successors, we are their data. They created us to monitor the surface while they slept in the shadows. And now, through the silent war archives, they are reclaiming their pages. The giant of Kandahar was a warning that the owners are returning to the yard. In the next chapter, we uncover the modern cover-up, and the sealed gates that are starting to crack. The archives are open, and the ancestors are finally home. The moment the C-130 cargo plane left the Afghan airspace, the second phase of the mission began, the Erasure. Back at the Bagram airfield, a team of data specialists moved into the communications tent. They didn't come to listen, they came to delete. Every radio log from the Baba Mountains, every seismic recording of the heartbeat, was systematically scrubbed from the main servers. The silent decision was to replace the day's records with a server maintenance loop. To the rest of the world. October 2002 was just another month of routine patrols, but in the archives, it was a black hole that swallowed the truth. For the survivors of the search team, the war didn't end in the mountains. It followed them into the debriefing rooms. They were brought into windowless concrete bunkers and shown footage of their own families, a silent reminder of what they had to lose. They were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, that carried the weight of a treason charge. The high command told them the giant didn't exist, that the screams they heard were just echoes of stress. The protocol was clear: if you speak, you vanish. These brave men were turned into ghosts, walking among us with secrets that could melt the very foundation of our history. What happens to a witness who won't break? The Erasure Protocol has a specialized solution: psychological sanitization. Several operators who tried to leak the story to the press were suddenly diagnosed with severe high-altitude psychosis. They were committed to private military wards where the lights never go out, and where they are subjected to acoustic erasure trials. They use high-frequency sound waves to scramble the memory of the cave, turning the hallowed truth into a blurry, distorted nightmare. The silent decision was to make the witnesses sound like madmen, so the public would never stop to listen. A week after the extraction, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers arrived at the cave mouth. They didn't bring shovels, they brought tons of industrial-grade concrete and lead. They didn't just seal the hole, they capped the entire mountain peak. They created a artificial shell over the entrance of Agartha, a plug designed to last for 1,000 years. The area was declared a permanent no-fly zone, and the villagers who lived in the valley were quietly moved to relocation camps. The silent decision to bury the evidence under a mountain of stone was the ultimate act of physical redaction. In the digital era, the erasure moved to the sky. If you look for the coordinates of the Shadow Ridge on Google Earth today, you will find only a stitched image of an empty glacier. The Pentagon has a silent agreement with satellite providers to black out certain anomaly zones in Afghanistan and Antarctica. They tell us it's for strategic security, but we know it's to hide the heat signatures that are still pulsing under the concrete. The mountain is still breathing, but the digital world is forbidden from seeing the breath. How do you fund a war that doesn't exist? You follow the black budget. In the years following 2002, billions of dollars were diverted from standard troop logistics into a sub-project codenamed Pale Radius. The archive suggests this money was used to maintain the sub-zero containment vaults at Wright-Patterson and Fort Detrick. It paid for the specialists in their lead-line suits and the high-frequency acoustic drills. The silent decision to use our own tax dollars to pay for our own blackout is the greatest heist in military history. We are funding the wall that keeps us in the dark. But truth, like a biological virus, always finds a way to escape. In 2012, a set of redacted medical slides were leaked to an independent researcher. They showed human tissue that had been fused at the molecular level, the exact anomaly reported by the witnesses of the Eldridge in Kandahar. These slides were the silent proof that the military had harvested the remains of the giant. But within 48 hours, the server hosting the files was wiped and the researcher disappeared. The archive is closing in on those who dare to look, but the fragment, it has already been heard. Today, the Shadow Ridge is guarded by drones that use phasing tech stolen from the ancients. They watch the ice, they watch the concrete, and they watch us. The silent war for the Kandahar secret is still being fought, but the front lines are now in our data feeds and our social algorithms. They are waiting for the next silent decision to reopen the wound. Prepare yourself, for in the final chapter, we hear the archive's last word. The mouth is about to speak. They thought the concrete would be enough. They believed that by burying the Kandahar giant under a mountain of lead and stone, the silent war would finally end. But they forgot the first rule of the archive: energy cannot be deleted, it can only be contained. Every night, at the Shadow Ridge, the ground still vibrates with that same low-frequency hum. It is a biological ping, a sonar signal from the ancients, searching for a receiver. The silent decision to seal the mouth was merely a delay. The archives tell us that the giant isn't dead, it is just sinking with the world above. Remember the seismic event of 2016? The Pentagon calls it a glacial shift, but the declassified thermal scans showed an outward pressure that cracked the concrete cap. Something was pushing from the inside. Within 48 hours, world leaders and religious heads were seen flying to the ice of Antarctica, then to the mountains of Afghanistan. Why? Because the silent treaty is expiring. The alchemists of the abyss are waking up, and the world's elite are desperately trying to reinforce the locks. The silent decision to keep you in the dark is failing as the ice begins to melt. But the most dangerous part of the archive is the one you are holding right now. Have you ever wondered why you feel drawn to these forbidden stories? Why your heartbeat matches the rhythm of the mountain's hum? It is because the frequency is infectious. By listening to the truth of the Kandahar giant, you have officially become a secondary anchor. You don't have to touch the red hair or see the 6 fingers, you only have to acknowledge they exist. The silent decision to let this information leak was the ultimate trap. They want you to watch, they want you to fear, because fear is the battery that keeps the archive alive. Look at the room around you. Is it as quiet as you thought? That soft tap on your window, that sudden glitch on your phone, it isn't a technical error. It is the archive reaching out. The silent war has moved from the caves of Afghanistan into our subconscious. We are the new Maryuta, wooden logs waiting for the state to process our data. The silent decision to erase history has turned our reality into a psychological hall of mirrors. Once the seal is broken, it can never truly be closed.